Thank you for volunteering as a test subject in today's experiment, because depending on which thumbnail you clicked on, you may have different expectations for this video, which says something about you that we're about to get into, but I get ahead of myself. Quick political science law that we need in order to move forward, and that is the unit of analysis. There's individual and systemic unit of analysis. The former is what we normally gravitate towards when troubleshooting problems. For example, this video could focus on figures in the Democratic Party such as Biden and tackling the trouble via the vantage point of a personal perspective, if you will. Yet the problem with this approach is that by attacking problems this way, it's much like trimming the branches of a tree with gangrene roots. While it feels cathartic to cleave that nasty branch that seems to greet you ominously every time you see it, addressing the roots may serve as a better means of dealing with the problem itself. Take that a step further. Address the soil, the environment that engenders the very breeding ground necessary for a tree to exist like this in the first place. Which is why I prefer the latter. I prefer to attack institutions rather than individuals. And sometimes it's difficult to extricate. Sometimes you need to address the individuals themselves. But today, we're going to be looking at the institutions, specifically the liberal institutions that people on the left claim that they don't want to challenge because they feel as though they'd be ceding ground to more conservative means of understanding, not knowing fully well that if we don't criticize these institutions, they're very much inclined to have the same propensity of evil that we like to assign to the right. And the liberal institution that I'd like to look at today is volunteerism, or I should actually call it voluntourism. This is a rare event where we actually have a solution to the problem, as I know many of you may wonder, what could you do that wouldn't, in effect, be exacerbating this problem that we're talking about today? And to that question, for folks who really won't put their money where their mouth is, stay tuned till the end to learn more about our partner, Give Directly, an organization that delivers donations as unconditional cash payments to people in need directly, not no middleman, directly. And you can use my link, givedirectly.org/foreign, to give a gift this season directly to the people who need it. But more on that later, because we have to talk about the problem before I talk about the solution. Volunteers are advertised as the most selfless beings on this earth, but they could actually be some of the most dangerous. Deadly, even. Take Renee Bach, for instance. At the bright-eyed age of 19, she wanted to get out of a small town in Virginia and do something bigger, something more meaningful. And that wasn't just a goal or a dream, no. This woman literally claimed that she heard a calling from God to set forth into the world and help the less fortunate. And the urge right there resulted in the death of dozens of children. Now, I usually try to come here and be lighthearted and funny about some really heavy topics, but I can't even attempt to do that today. 105 children gone. All because one unqualified, inexperienced, and frankly, extremely egotistical person wanted to ride in like a white knight and save the day. Now, I want to preface this with some disclaimers. My goal here isn't to shame folks who volunteer, rather than investigate an industry and motivations behind it, because we will soon learn that Renee is but the tip of the iceberg. I say this as someone who has volunteered as well. This is me calling myself out. But first, let's back up to 2009. Renee Bach had just returned home from a missionary trip to Uganda, where she had spent 9 months working at an orphanage. The whole thing left a major impact on her. She wanted to do more than just your run-of-the-mill outreach expedition that every other evangelical Christian she knew accomplished. As she so humbly told NPR in an interview, it was a very, very profound feeling and experience. It's kind of hard to even describe in words. Like there was something that I was supposed to do.
What is feeling called by God? What is that like?
Baby John!
I just started to see malnutrition everywhere. So many children came seeking help.
So she took her piousness a step further and decided to create her very own charity called Serving His Children. It was a big job. This gal had no idea what it took to support these communities or children in an effective way. But she wasn't going to let the little things like necessary skills or competence get in her way. No, of course not. She was on a mission from God, after all. Who needs silly things like medical training when you're working with sick, at-risk youth, when you have the Lord on your side? In the beginning, the goal of the program was to simply provide food to families around the Jinja neighborhood in Uganda. In fact, Jinja is a popular place for Christian mission trips, alluding to a much larger trend that we're about to touch on shortly. But when you first hear something like that, it seems okay. It seems righteous. I mean, who is going to argue with giving food to people who need food? And at first, it did seem like this program at least wasn't actively harming the community. But soon their mission warped into something else. This charity, serving its children, wasn't about putting a hot meal on the table anymore. No. Now the organization became the city's go-to medical facility for treating sick and malnourished children. Now they were in charge of saving the lives of kids with deadly conditions. The problem with that was that almost nobody involved, especially Renee, had any type of medical background. They were going in completely blind and just making it all up as they went along. Over the course of 5 years, from 2010 to 2015, Renee's charity took in 940 starving and sick children for treatment. And I'm sure the whole time she was thinking, something is better than nothing. No, wrong, actually. Over 100 of the babies under her program's care passed away. 1 out of every 9 kids that walked through those doors of her facility would die under her care.
Mwene yavuye no mulambo gwe ngaguzinze mungoye omuzungu yaguta mmotoka yaguta akuntebe ngaguzinze ngandi mudawuti.
There's not a doubt in my mind that many of these deaths came from this lady thinking that she could put on a white coat and pretend to be a doctor. Negligence is the understatement of the century when discussing Renee Bach. Families in Uganda went to her charity because they thought that they were trustworthy. They believed that they were a legitimate medical facility that would help their children. Oftentimes, the kids that went to Renee's clinic only had minor ailments and ended up leaving with way more severe conditions afterwards.
That is keba kimye singa kibiti obamutwela kwesasira kila musango mundo na ribona ngwa murola khobera bara khuteni ne khutse khumulolele khobone sitiraho are khotsa khumulolela. The
part that really gets me is it's not even like these people had no other option besides Renee Bach's clinic. Many sources claim that she actually went so far as to manipulate families into sending their children to her instead of going to a legitimate, licensed, real hospital for treatment. Like I said, man, she wanted the glory, even if it came at the cost of children's lives. Red flags started popping up for well-intentioned volunteers. They would come over to Uganda thinking that SHC was a legit organization, only to be horrified when they arrived and discovered that something much more sinister was going on here. There was one volunteer named Jackie that was an actual registered nurse from North Dakota. Once she arrived in Uganda, she quickly realized that they weren't just simply feeding malnourished kids at Renee's charity. They were attempting to treat serious deadly illnesses with absolutely no idea what they were doing. Jackie said she saw kids with intestinal parasites, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and many of them were in stage 4 HIV, and none of them were getting the care that they desperately needed. Jackie recalled one disturbing incident where Renee was treating a 9-month-old named Patricia. She thought she had malaria, and the solution was to give her an immediate blood transfusion, but in less than 30 minutes, the baby started having a horrible reaction. She called in Jackie since she was one of the only people at the charity with any sort of real medical knowledge to ask for help, but it was already really, really bad. But all Renee had to say was, I think she may be having a reaction, but I don't know because, Google says if they're having a reaction, they'll have a rash, and I don't see a rash. That's a literal quotation. Google. Yeah, she consulting Google at this point. Yeah, it sounds incredulous, it sounds apocryphal, but this woman was genuinely Googling away symptoms to tell her how to save a baby's life while saving the baby's life. Thankfully, a real doctor urged them to rush Patricia to a hospital, and miraculously she ended up pulling through. But many of the children under Renee's care weren't as lucky. It wasn't long after that Jackie decided she couldn't be a part of such a hazardous operation anymore. And soon people outside the charity were even starting to notice that something was up at serving his children. After a few years of playing doctor with Ugandan children's lives, rumors started swirling that maybe Renee's charity wasn't what it seemed to be. Maybe it wasn't so selfless and great after all. Families started calling out and saying she was the one with those children's blood on her hands. And how did she respond? By running away. Renee decided that she had done enough good work in Uganda and fled back to her cozy little hometown of Bedford, Virginia. And to top it off, she took one of the young girls who was brought into serving his children and adopted her as her own daughter. And I have questions about that too, but that's for another time. And just like that, she thought that was it. Her charity work was completed and she could just go back to living a comfortable, God-loving life. But that wasn't the case. Renee might have operated for years, feeding her own ego through this charity, but you can't just cause the deaths of that many innocent children without someone noticing. Soon, she couldn't hide it anymore.
The Bedford woman is facing disturbing allegations about her nonprofit in Uganda.
Essentially, a U.S. citizen with no medical training set up a medical clinic in Uganda and is now being accused of killing 119 African children.
They were led to believe that Miss Renee Bach was a medical doctor and that her home was a medical facility, as she was often seen wearing a white coat, a stethoscope, and often administered medications to children in her care. The actions of Renee and SHC led to the death of hundreds of children. Renee, that is a serious allegation.
Renee is being sued in Ugandan court, and the lawsuit alleges Renee killed hundreds of children.
And I'm sure you already know that she tried to speak out and defend herself.
I think some of the most wild accusations that were made about me is that I killed 800 children. I was medically experimenting on children compared to Adolf Hitler, assumed to be part of the KKK. But I have never practiced medicine, and I have never adorned or put on any sort of a uniform or white coat for that matter.
But it was already too little, too late. In 2020, Renee ended up coming to a settlement with the families who had lost children at her hands and agreed to pay each one around $9,500 as a way of bringing them closure. But still to this day, she does not admit that she was liable for the kid's death in any way. I show in her mind that she still thinks she went over there with good intentions and that matters more than the outcome of her actions. And you know, when this story blew up a few years back, lots of people looked at Renee as an exception to the rule. Volunteering as a whole, as an industry, is still an admirable pursuit that helps people, right? But that isn't always the case. Renee Bach is not an anomaly. She's one of many. Volunteering has built up a reputation of being selfless and wholesome. And I say this as someone that had a volunteering quota in my high school curriculum and my college curriculum. As many of y'all probably had a history of varying degrees of volunteerism. I propose to you a tough question, however. Are you truly helping people, or are you helping yourself? I ask myself this question. Because the dark truth is that this is an industry that pulls in billions of dollars a year. Altruism is a hell of a good tagline to make people buy into your cause. Literally. What if I told you that some of these volunteer programs actively keep marginalized communities down for their own benefit? In my graduate program, we studied a phenomenon called dependency theory. But today, I take another step further. Because today, we are wading into one of the most dangerous and profitable grifts the world has ever seen. And what better place to start than the UN peacekeepers? International organizations are taken as a given today. But there was a time when they didn't exist in society at all. And after you learn about this, you could be wondering if maybe that was for the best. Because when I tell you some of the vile things that people was doing under the guise of saving the world. But let me stay on track, ADHD be damned. Let's go back about 75 years ago. The UN peacekeepers. After World War II, every country was going through it, and there was still a lot of tension in the air. They wanted to create some sort of global group that could, well, keep the peace. They were basically going to be like the American National Guard, but on an international scale.
United Nations peacekeeping operations are deployed once the Security Council, the UN Security Council, authorizes the deployment of the mission. That happens, and a resolution is passed that enables us, we, the Secretariat, to pull together all the resources that we need, that the Council has authorized, to go off and complete the specific tasks that they've assigned us.
The idea was that these peacekeepers would be sent out to various needy places around the globe and support communities with stuff like healthcare, economics, or security. The very first mission set off in 1948 to oversee the armistice agreement between Israel and Arab countries around it. It seemed like their monitoring process was successful, at least for the time being. This bit of initial success gave them a bit of confidence to kick it up into high gear. Over the past 7 decades, more than 1 million people have helped to carry out over 70 different UN peacekeeping missions. It's a huge operation that the average person thinks is magnanimous, and I gotta give them credit where it's due. They definitely have done some really good marketing.
Every day, women working in today's UN peacekeeping operations and special political missions are doing their part to help build a better and more peaceful world. So, how do you join?
UN peacekeeping is the international community's most effective tool to help countries transition from conflict to peace.
When you get an organization that big, with that much power, going to vulnerable places at an economic disadvantage, you probably begin to see an issue can possibly occur. And the UN peacekeepers are actually hiding the fact that a scary amount of their missions result in disturbing unintended consequences. Now look, these guys probably started off with great intentions. I don't think everybody's a villain. Kind of like Renee Bach might not have meant to do so much harm early on. I'm sure there are some people that get involved that think they're doing a positive thing, and they're not just doing this to make their resume or their, college applications look good. But even the good intentions can spiral out of control quickly and become something far darker. We already saw that happen with Renee on a much smaller scale, but the UN took it to a whole nother level. One thing you gotta understand about the UN peacekeepers is that since they're given a lot of authority wherever they go, they're supposed to uphold 3 key rules.
UN peace operations and UN peacekeeping missions have different mandates based on the circumstances on the ground and what the Council authorizes. But each mission operates on the basis of a number of consistent principles, regardless of how big or small the mission happens to be.
1. Consent of the parties. The UN peacekeepers are only meant to step in if there's a standing agreement between the parties in conflict. Otherwise, they run the risk of making things worse and appearing non-neutral. 2. Impartiality. The whole purpose of the peacekeepers is that they're supposed to be neutral. They are not there to take anyone's side. They're just there to maintain order. And 3. Avoid the use of force except for self-defense or defense of the mandate. These guys aren't supposed to be soldiers, you see? The whole thing is about preventing more violence from happening. But of course, there is that little footnote in the rules stating that force is acceptable if they're protecting themselves, civilians, or the goal of the mission. Which sounds a lot like a gray area to me, but hey, that's just me. When you lay it out like that, yeah, sounds ironclad. The problem is, however, that the UN peacekeepers have continued to break their own principles time and time again. It's pretty much turned them into a bunch of hypocrites. Now, actually worse than that, because they're doing way more damage than the average hypocrite. While many places around the globe have suffered in the name of the peacekeepers' righteousness, Haiti has gotten it far worse than almost anywhere else, in my opinion. The things that the volunteers did to these Haitian communities are beyond heinous, and honestly, they're really difficult to even hear. So trigger warning, because right now it's about to get extremely disturbing. The peacekeepers were in and out of Haiti through the 90s due to political unrest, they said. When things weren't calming down the way that they'd hoped, it eventually led to them creating the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti. This was around 2004, I believe. This is where a lot of the devastation started. Instead of viewing these at-risk communities as human beings that they were trying to help, many of these employees viewed Haiti as their hunting ground. Years after the fact, researchers spoke with the women and children who lived in these areas where the UN peacekeepers worked and discovered that many of them had a similar experience. They would offer women and children bits of food or a little bit of money in exchange for favors. And this exchange resulted in an epidemic of young Haitian girls being left pregnant and completely alone. Girls as young as 11 years old. I have a child myself, so imagining these kids thinking that the peacekeeper heroes were coming to their rescue only for things to get far worse than they'd ever imagined. Out of just a small group of researchers interviewed, 265 of them said that the fathers of their children were UN staff who quickly left them to fend for themselves and our child by themselves. Most of these victims were between the age of 12 and 13 years old. 12 and 13. And Haiti wasn't alone. Citizens of the Democratic Republic of Congo had similar issues with the UN peacekeepers, if not worse. One 13-year-old girl from DRC was quickly abandoned by a UN peacekeeper after he got her pregnant. The only way she could provide for her child alone was just trading favors with other peacekeepers in exchange for basic necessities like soap, milk, and bread. She never heard from the child's biological father again. And I gotta emphasize here, this story isn't one in a million. This isn't an anomaly. This isn't an exception. This is rampant. And also a side note, I'm saying favors here on YouTube, but what these people did is by no ambiguous terms exactly what you think they did. That's what it's called when you withhold necessary aid unless you get something that you want. Not to mention that these peacekeepers couldn't even do their job right. The Congo actually requested that the UN leave because they actually hadn't done anything to make the situation any better the decade that they had been there. The atrocities these men committed against these innocent children pissed me off more than I could put into words and more than I could communicate in this small letterbox that you're watching. But then thinking about how they probably went back home without a care in the world, pretending that they did something good for the world. They probably got exhalations from their peers, their comrades, maybe even the government themselves. They go back to families and they get pats on the back, kisses from their children, and it's foul. But that's just one aspect of how they damaged the country. We can't forget about the time that the UN peacekeepers were also held responsible for the death of 10,000 Haitians as well. Cholera is a deadly illness caused by drinking water that is contaminated with a specific type of bacteria, right? Back in the day, it wasn't really a concern for Haiti because the country had been completely cholera-free for a while. But all that changed in 2010 thanks to the peacekeepers. One of the UN camps where the peacekeepers were living dumped their sewage into the nearby river, and the matter was infected with cholera. It just so happened that the sewage was left to rot in the biggest source of drinking water in the entire country. And the effects of this outbreak were absolutely devastating, as you can imagine.
Fearing the outbreak of cholera in Haiti, nearly 200 people have already died and thousands are infected by the epidemic. The United Nations is now concerned about a large-scale health crisis if the disease spreads to camps, sheltering those already affected by the earthquake that hit Haiti last January.
And with cholera cases now in the capital, Port-au-Prince, experts are warning the disease could affect as many as 200,000 people.
I am at St. Nicholas Hospital in St. Mark's, and behind me still scenes of chaos, unfortunately, Fred. I can tell you outside these gates, people continually come every hour. They are hunched over, vomiting, they have diarrhea. Some people already have been sick for 2 or 3 days.
Health officials in Haiti have issued red alerts throughout the country due to a cholera epidemic. 5 years after its outbreak, cholera is still killing people in the troubled Caribbean nation. This year alone, there has been an outbreak of 16,000 cases, according to the country's health ministry. Around 175 people have died from the disease.
Since the UN caused the outbreak, approximately 10,000 people have died from cholera and more than 820,000 were infected in total. It's really wild to me. The supposed big leagues of peacekeeping can't even manage to keep their nasty, infected sewage out of people's water. And it's even wilder that the UN tried to just play this whole thing off as if it wasn't entirely their fault.
These demonstrators believe the United Nations is to blame for Haiti's cholera epidemic. So does the UN Special Representative for Haiti, President Bill Clinton. He said a Nepalese peacekeeper most likely brought the disease to the country. But the UN, facing a complaint from 5,000 Haitian victims who want to be compensated, denies responsibility.
It wasn't even until 2016 that they acknowledged the fact that they were responsible for this massive health crisis. At that point, they said that they would provide financial support to fix the drinking water and help out the families that were affected by the disease, even promising that they would raise $400 million for the cause. But of course, you can imagine that those are empty words as well. The UN peacekeepers still haven't given the victims a penny. When these folks are doing something that looks good on paper, that looks good on the news, there's always some twisted motive behind it. Like back in 2010, when the major food conglomerate Monsanto offered to donate 475 tons of hybrid corn and offer like vegetable seeds to Haiti after it was hit by an earthquake. Let me make one thing clear. When a multi-billion-dollar food monopoly says that they're doing an act of charity, get suspicious, get your spidey senses up, because these sorts of companies do not care about helping the people that they claim that they are. They're buying goodwill so that you could buy their products. And they're always after some sort of benefit. Monsanto, which is an evil in itself for a whole bunch of other reasons, tried to make it seem like they were donating these seeds out of the kindness of their hearts, but of course there was a hidden agenda. The seeds were laced with super toxic pesticides that could have easily damaged the area's farming land. But the even more covert, malicious motivation was that Monsanto wanted Haiti to be dependent on them. They wanted to ensure that the nation would never be able to support themselves with their own food supply and that they would always be in need of aid. Luckily, the locals caught on to how sketchy the whole thing was, calling the offer a very strong attack on small agriculture, on farmers, on biodiversity, on Creole seeds, and on what is left of our environment in Haiti. They actually decided the best move was to burn all the seeds.
Everybody burn Monsanto seeds together.
And the march in protest to show how sick of the that they were.
Why are they protesting today? Why isn't he protesting?
Because Monsanto sucks. Monsanto's the only thing they're interested in is dollars.
When you take a step back and look at the UN peacekeepers for what they truly are, it's obvious that this isn't about altruism or helping anyone. They're not trying to keep the peace for the greater good. It's all a sham. It's all a grift. The peacekeepers are actually incompetent at best, and at worst, they are full of con artists or full-blown predators. And if you think the UN peacekeepers is bad, let me tell you something. Wait until you hear about what the unregulated NGOs are doing while nobody's paying them attention. On the other end of the volunteer spectrum, you got non-governmental organizations and private programs. These guys are the ones who are really responsible for turning the do-gooder white savior syndrome into a billion-dollar business called volunteerism. You see, humans love the feeling of being a good person more than actually being a good person themselves. There's something incredibly gratifying about thinking you're making a positive difference in the world. It's almost like it's its own kind of high. I mean, who doesn't want to be a selfless hero? Especially when you could go home and put all your good deeds on your resume and college applications and make yourself look better. That's where these companies saw an opportunity to make a fortune. All they had to do was provide these people from wealthy countries with the chance to buy themselves that heartwarming experience, even if it directly harmed the communities the programs were claiming to help. So businesses like Project Abroad and International Volunteer HQ started offering these programs where Westerners could pay a fee, then go to volunteer in a foreign country. They painted it as the perfect situation. Participants get to go on a vacation and aid local communities at the same time. The volunteers go home feeling good about themselves, people in need get help, and everybody wins.
We were all trying to make the most of our time, combining voluntary service with exploring the region and traveling. We were trying to interact with local people, just traveling around or just like relaxing at the beach on the weekends.
If your red flag-o-meter isn't beeping off the charts at this point, you gotta get it checked. This isn't some little snorkeling trip or walking around a city and taking scenic pictures for your IG. These are real people's lives and homes, not just a tourist attraction. And paying a company thousands of dollars to go volunteer, red flag.
My sister in Christ. Ma'am. Madam.
Despite how fishy the whole thing sounds, millions of people are falling for it every single year. To be exact, 10 million people, usually from North America and Europe, go off on volunteering in impoverished communities annually. And they really got something for everyone at these programs. Well, something for every person who's paying at least. They're all different types of opportunities depending on what the volunteerist wants. Want to renovate and build schools in Tanzania? That dream can be yours for the low price of $470. Want to save endangered turtles in Costa Rica? No problem. All you need is $1,000 to participate. How about assisting with rhino conservation efforts? Sounds memorable? That'll run you $2,236. You could teach these classes to school kids in Nepal for $1,600. You could help conserve the rainforest in Peru for $2,400 or protect sharks in Fiji for the mere $3,200. No matter what type of volunteer tourism experience you're craving, there's a project out there for you. All those things sound very magical and rewarding at face value, but there are about 50 massive issues with getting a bunch of inexperienced foreigners to come and do all this work.
They have good intentions. The problem arises from the volunteers' preparation and mindset. They go into the country thinking that they know best, that it is their job to save the country. They think, if I don't do it, who will?
Okay, let's start off with the most basic problem. These volunteers have absolutely no idea what they're doing. Imagine hiring someone to build your house who has never even laid a brick before. What happens? The project takes far longer than it should. They end up doing a far worse job than someone actually credentialed can do. And usually the community ends up worse than it even started off with. Oftentimes the locals are the ones training the volunteers. And when they inevitably mess up everything, it's these locals again who come in to fix their mistakes. The ones who are supposed to be receiving the aid in the first place. What's the point? Yeah, that's right. Making the tourist dreams of being a savior come true and making the company's dreams of millions in profits a reality. Secondly, and arguably even worse in my opinion, is the fact that these volunteers are taking away these professional opportunities from locals for their very little picaresque volunteerism vacation. All this stuff is the chance for people from Nepal or Peru or Costa Rica to have a living, and it's being snatched away from them because private volunteerism companies want to make a buck off getting inexperienced, unqualified labor to do it. It keeps the communities in this cycle of needing help as opposed to ever solving a problem for good. I mean, technically, if these programs doing their job, shouldn't there be less of them now? The people doing construction and conservation are just a small percentage of these projects too. The big one, the moneymaker, is childcare and orphanages. And I ain't gonna lie, this is pure evil. It usually shakes out like this. A major crisis goes down like that one in 2004 where a tsunami in Sri Lanka, for example, left a bunch of kids without homes or parents. And then in response, donors from wealthy countries send money to set up orphanages in the country where these children can be looked after. But even after the disaster boils over, the institution keeps getting money. And they think, well, why the hell should we close now? When volunteerism started blowing up, these organizations realized that there was way more money on the table than just donations. These people wanting to do hands-on charity could bring in millions. Just like that, these temporary solutions to help needy kids turns into a booming business. Orphanages can peddle these sad, abandoned children to Westerners, and they will actually pay money for the chance to take care of them. But the thing is, you gotta have kids in order to have an orphanage. Supply and demand. And while most of these volunteers think that these children don't have anyone else in the world to care for them, that is rarely the case. One study found that in Sri Lanka, 92% of the children staying in orphanages actually had a living parent out there. In Liberia, it was more like 98% of the kids who are actually not orphaned. So what does that mean? Well, it means that these places are basically trafficking kids to make sure they have enough of them to keep the volunteers entertained, making them live in the worst conditions possible to hopefully tug at some Westerners' heartstrings and get even more money. Orphanages have become one of the biggest and most profitable tourist attractions in a lot of countries like Cambodia and Nepal. When you think about it for 5 seconds, it's obviously how damaging this practice is. Imagine being a child at an orphanage living in rough conditions with no family around. When finally a volunteer comes in and they're actually nice to you, you build a bond, a connection, and you start to feel comfortable. And then in a matter of weeks, they disappear forever and you never see them again. Now think about that happening over and over and over again in your entire childhood. It's heartbreaking. It's a recipe for attachment issues at the very least.
Hello. Nepal's many orphanages attract voluntourists from around the world, part of a booming billion-dollar global voluntourism industry, especially popular with young Western backpackers.
Scott says he's had some bad experiences with volunteers.
One, they're not reliable. They may turn up the first day. If they don't like it, they won't turn up the second. And secondly, there's often a difference of opinion on what the attitude should be. We are running a very serious operation. What we do is important in our eyes. It's a serious priority. Whereas a lot of those who are on temporary visits, backpacking, don't believe they're doing us a favour by actually being there. And there's often a bit of friction.
Most of these places aren't even checking the volunteers' backgrounds at all before they give them full access to these vulnerable kids. Kaylee Myler is one of the most ostensible cases that typify the dangers we're talking about today. There's no oversight. Nobody there making sure that these babies are actually being taken care of. And it's resulted in some very messed up outcomes, as you can imagine.
Guilty on 7 charges. That's what a jury's decided in the trial of an Edmund man accused of abusing orphans in Kenya.
In news coming in from Kerala in Wayanad, a group of 6 men have been arrested for abusing 7 girls from an orphanage there. These men would apparently offer girls things to eat and then take them to private places and sexually assault them.
Despite the fact that anybody with common sense could see that this whole system is a bit sketch, it still hasn't stopped millions of people from jumping on this trend. Today, the volunteerism industry is worth about $3 billion. If you think any of that money is going towards improving the local communities or helping the kids in need, you got another thing coming. One former volunteer was disgusted to find out that 0% of a massive program fee went towards the cause or the local family who graciously hosted her while she was volunteering. She wasn't the only one that had her eyes open to the truth about these private volunteerism companies either. One woman named Pippa Biddle had volunteered all over the world in her early 20s, working with kids who had HIV in the Dominican Republic and doing construction projects in Tanzania. Eventually, she began to realize that she and her volunteer friends weren't actually doing anything to make the situation in these countries better, in the slightest. In fact, they were actively hurting these places and their people. As she put it straight up, taking part in international aid where you aren't particularly helpful is not benign, it's detrimental. There are millions of people every year who think it is okay to buy access to vulnerable children and then disseminate images of them across the internet. When I was making this video, that's actually a very big thing I noticed. The visual rhetoric, the aesthetic that attracts so-called do-gooders to volunteer abroad. Sure, you could say you felt a calling or you wanted to do your part, but I think the whole look at what a good person I am helping these poor black kids thing is stronger pull. At that point, you're not even viewing us as people anymore. It's like getting your photo taken with Mickey Mouse at Disneyland. You just want the souvenir, the clout. And look, I'm not saying that every single volunteer on the planet has that mindset. I'm sure there are a few that genuinely are qualified and actually dedicate their lives to making a real difference for the people that they're actually helping. But a considerable amount, especially people who work with private NGO volunteerism companies, are not those people that we're talking about. Make no mistake about it. The volunteerists and the companies facilitating these programs are in it to benefit themselves in one way or another. So the UN peacekeepers do it to maintain order, and volunteers do it as a unique vacation experience that they can brag about for the rest of their lives. Then there's the international volunteers who are on a mission from God. If anyone was gonna be legit volunteers, people who really want to help for no reason other than doing a good deed, it has to be the religious folks that are just getting out there doing God's work, right? Religious groups embarking on missionary trips were some of the very first international volunteers from hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, the saviors of God. Historically, there have been missionaries from every religion under the sun, but these days, the most common ones are Christian. Now, some people might not put missionaries in the same category as privatized volunteerism companies. They think, oh, one of the basic tenets of religion is doing good deeds. You shall love your neighbor as yourself and all that. But really, they're just another version of the same grift disguised in different clothes, garments, if you will. Sure, the pretext might be to serve God by supporting a disenfranchised community, but there's an ulterior motive hidden there. A motive called spreading the religion far and wide. Back in the day, this practice went by a different name, if you catch my drift. Colonialism. Going off to foreign lands is much more about getting more people hooked on Jesus than it is about tending to their physical needs on earth or bettering their situation long term. Plus, of course, there's the other big benefit. The whole thing makes them seem like the best, holiest, most compassionate children of God. They can't do any wrong once they've coveted that persona. It all becomes this big show to put a feather in the cap of religious organizations these missionaries work for. Yes, you heard me correctly. Work for, as one columnist so eloquently put it. Missionaries turn black and brown children into props for a contrived image of saviorism, making them feel good about themselves, even if these trips have more insidious consequences. Do you think these missionaries give a damn about the local customs or beliefs of the people they're meant to be selflessly helping out of the goodness of their heart? Of course not. Nah, they're basically there to stomp them out. For missionaries, volunteering doesn't just mean providing food or shelter or healthcare. No, it means saving people's soul. In other words, their main concern is changing their religious beliefs, not the lives of the country for the better. And that isn't even a figure of speech. Oftentimes, these groups will straight up refuse to help anyone that isn't going to get in line with Christianity or whatever religion they're marketing today. Charity comes with the contingency of bowing down to a Christian God and once colonial power. You know, when you break down the history of it, the countries that are getting all this assistance from missionaries today are the very ones who were impacted most by imperialism and colonialism yesterday. Some would still say currently. That's no accident. Once again, Haiti is unfortunately a perfect example of this. Haiti has been gangbanged by a multitude of Western powers for centuries. And let's not forget the United States. They poke their nose around the country's business and use them like their own personal plantation. So much so that their economy has been stripped bare to this day. With all these struggling citizens left in the US's wake, missionary groups see them as an ideal opportunity for saving. Every single year, 1,700 long-term missionaries, hundreds of short-term missionary trips, and 2,000 missionary-run Christian schools are sent off to Haiti. But similarly to the private voluntourism companies, one of the primary issues with missionaries is that they have no bloody idea what they're doing. They have no skills or background knowledge on how to build homes or provide medical care. All they have is the Lord's guidance. And it obviously isn't getting them that far. In the process, they're stealing all the jobs away from the locals to complete their special mission. What's even worse is, with these missionaries specifically, most of them bring their whole family, including young kids, along for the ride. Many of the children who were taken on these trips were left alone with other missionaries while their parents were out spreading the good word. And just like in the orphanage where the neglected kids were exposed to all sorts of inhumane abuse, the same thing often happens with these missionary kids.
Carrie Mickinson was just a little girl in the mid-'80s when the missionaries assigned to protect her began to abuse her.
From roughly 6 to 8 years old, my dorm father abused me. The physical abuse was most of the teachers there and dorm parents.
One former missionary kid named Teresa recalled that she was only given food if she agreed to perform acts. But when she was brave enough to confide in her parents about what happened, they didn't believe her because the missionary school just said she had an overactive imagination. And that was the experience for a lot of these kids when they came forward. Their parents often didn't believe them. They thought there was no way that a good Christian would do that to a child. So they thought, my kid must be a liar. The amount of suffering that these supposedly holy programs are causing is just tragic. It's bad enough that they're destroying communities who are already struggling to get out of the hole that Western countries have put them in. But you can ignore your own baby is suffering? All of that pain and agony, what for? Well, I can tell you one thing. It damn sure ain't helping the countries they're claiming that they're trying to save. With all these thousands of people on the ground, you would think that maybe there would be some positive change after all this time, but no. Year after year, we just gotta help Haiti. They're in such poverty. Then they send all these volunteers over, and then yet again, next year, it's, oh, poor Haiti, still struggling. We gotta go help them. But they change absolutely nothing about how they go about doing that. They just go back, accomplish nothing, and then keep saying how badly they need outside help. It's a vicious cycle. And that's by design. They're not trying to fix the broken system that was born from colonialism. In fact, the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as it's supposed to. But they claim it's broken. And they're just throwing a Band-Aid over the issue and calling it a day. A dirty, pre-used, pointless Band-Aid that will probably lead to a nasty infection after that. They don't want them to heal. They want these places in a perpetual state of need, of lack. They want them dependent. It's about control and also buying a reservoir of goodwill. Think about it. These companies, these groups spend thousands of dollars flying out missionaries and giving them some place to stay, but none of these funds go directly to helping the communities. And why is that? Why is it that though it is proven that they will benefit far more with direct funds given to them? Why don't they do that? It's because they don't want them to get better. Why cure the disease if it's far more profitable to medicate it? The whole goal is to keep them dependent. The whole thing reminds me kind of a financially abusive relationship, if I'm being real. You got one partner who controls all the money and at will decides, yeah, baby, let me buy you some dinner. And that person seems to be the nice one, the altruistic one. Sure, it feeds them for a night and gives them off the facade that they're taken care of, but the next day, everything is completely the same. They don't have control and end up stuck in the same situation. If anything, the meal just makes the other partner sink deeper because they think they need them. It keeps them dependent on a larger scale. That's what these Western countries have been doing with their assortment of volunteer programs for forever. Whether it's religious missionaries, private volunteerism programs, or even the UN, they're all playing the same game. They display the appearance of generosity to foster dependence. Volunteers get to be the good guys, and it keeps these communities right in line where they want them. And it worked. I mean, not whatever they're trying to do, claiming that they help. That didn't work. But this worked. Haiti, year after year, needs more aid because it's not even aid at this point. It's an abusive situation that keeps them locked in this relationship where they're constantly in need.
That Africa remains one of the very poorest regions in the world. And in fact, it's been a great failure of the world. There were 167 million people living in poverty in Africa in 1980. And today there are 470 million people.
Now, if you're not like the folks that I'm describing, and you're one of those folks that actually want to help, I have news for you. Because while the industry of volunteerism has created a very dark reality, not all hope is lost. There is still a way that you can actually make a positive difference in the world without adding and exacerbating the problem. And that's by direct giving. You want to be the change that you see in the world? Well, first thing is, tear up the check that you are going to write to some huge bureaucratic charity or volunteerism program. All it's going to do is make those guys richer than they already are. If they haven't helped by now, they're never going to.
there were these great campaigns to make poverty history. The Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, goal number 1 was meant to be to end extreme poverty by 2030. And the world has completely lost focus on this. And it's a tragedy because, in fact, it would not take a great deal of effort to make a huge difference. Something like 0.1, 0.2% of global GDP would be all that it would take to fill that poverty gap in Africa.
The issue is that a lot of these charities aren't doing the things that are proven to help. They're doing things for the gram. You see, when you donate to a big-name charity organization, a fat chunk of that is lost due to complicated systems that basically guess what people want or give them things that are proven not to make the tangible material changes people may need. That's evinced clearly by this graph. It's only the scraps that are ever may be handed to the people that actually need it, the ones that the donors think they're helping.
And this is something that we should be taking a long, hard look at. We should be feeling very, very ashamed of the failure of the international community to help Africa.
The solution is very simple and clear-cut, and that's to actually serve these marginalized communities in a positive way by giving directly to them. There's no excuses, no middleman. All of the funds just go straight to the recipient. Not only does this help ensure that money will end up in the right hands, but it also ensures that these funds are going to be used in the right way. It's utilized to actually uplift the community and its people instead of keeping them in the same draining cycle. Direct giving is the key to actually breaking the pattern of dependency on wealthy Western countries once and for all. And the results really speak for themselves. When people in need are helped directly instead of using some sketchy third party, it creates real, palpable change. Strengthened dietary diversity, an increase in education, improved health services, citizens actually getting out of poverty. It does so much more than simply sending untrained volunteers to take over and pretend that they're helping. Pretend they know what's best for these communities and dictating exactly how every dollar of aid is spent. $1,000, which is the cost of one leg of a volunteerism flight. That same $1,000 given to someone in extreme poverty has been proven to make long-term improvements to their income, assets, education, food security, psychological well-being, and their children's growth. One study found that when unconditional cash transfers were given to people in Mexico, individual household incomes increased by 2.5 times. It seriously improved their quality of life instead of making them reliant on volunteer organizations to meet their basic needs. Hundreds of studies showed this works. It's not intuition or good feelings or a nice Facebook page of stories. No, there are randomized controlled trials and studies, including one that shows it can grow the local economy by as much as 2.5 times what you give. Because these people are not children. They actually know what their community and home needs more than these big volunteer conglomerates ever could.
People in extreme poverty frequently don't require knowledge. What they require is capital. Take Jean. A traditional program of the sort that I used to run when I worked for the government would have gone in and taught her how to run her business. But Jean already knows how to run her grocery business. She just doesn't have the money for the biscuits.
That's really the heart of the issue. We're spending all this money sending Westerners over to live their white savior fantasy, controlling every aspect of charity to the point where it's not really giving at all anymore. It's getting. It's a business on its best day and a complete scam on its worst. But I told you there was a glimmer of hope, and this is it. It's called Give Directly. With Give Directly, you can be a part of the real solution finally. This nonprofit is seriously a breath of fresh air amongst all of the dodgy volunteerism companies looking to take advantage in one way or another. And I really needed that energy after all these evil things that I had to read on the sake of this video. I swear, bro, there was a lot. Unlike the others, Give Directly allows donors to send unconditional cash right now to families living in poverty. There's no secrets, no gray area, no intermediary, just sending funds to the people that need it the most and making a massive long-term difference in the community process.
We've been helped by a revolution in technology in Africa, which is mobile money. And many, many Africans now are able to receive money directly on their phones. And if someone doesn't have a phone, we will issue them with a telephone. That allows us to transfer cash directly from someone in the United States or Europe right into the hands of the most extreme poor. And the results are revolutionary. It is extraordinary how what would be a small amount of money for you or I can be life-transforming in a poor community in Africa. You see the most wonderful things.
What makes Give Directly different than the NGOs we discussed today is that they've actually done the research, they've done the legwork by asking the people in need what they need. And they use that research to develop this concept of aid. They're actually held accountable by external auditing systems, so they have a fiduciary responsibility to being transparent and straightforward with where your donation is actually going. This is a big one. They've also been transparent about their mistakes in the past, which if you watch this channel regularly, you know that I believe allying the most marginalized is a road marred with mistakes, and being able to admit to them is important. And Give Directly has been transparent about theirs and have put systems in place to try to prevent those things from happening again. Most importantly, they've gone to great lengths to mitigate harm in the communities that they're working and helping, as well as trying to prevent the mishandling of funds. Let me tell you why this one is so personal to me. When Give Directly came directly to me, immediately my spidey senses started tingling because I'm from a developing country. I live in a developing country. I have seen how predatory NGOs can be while disguised as being good Samaritans. But then I spoke with the staff who not only transparently welcomed my questions and criticisms, they revealed that they actually been to my home country of the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian ravished my country. They were able to show me how they directly helped people who were most in need. And I followed up. Sure enough, it was true. Folks in Abaco, where the hurricane did the most harm, remember Give Directly fondly and spoke glowingly about how dignified they handled their aid. And that's really important because we're a proud people. And sometimes that results in us not asking for help when we really need it. Look, the holidays are coming up, a new year is around the corner. This is the time for giving after all, and I understand the urge. So if you get in the mood to do something good for the world, something tangible and effective, not performative, this is where you want to go. Go to my link, givedirectly.org/foreign, and tell them Foreign sent you. You can be sure that your donations will go straight to families in a village in central Kenya. And if you give now, they'll get that cash early next year and be able to spend that on what they need the most. Now, if you remember earlier, you may have gotten a thumbnail that focused on a different level of analysis. A thumbnail that's centered on the individual versus a thumbnail that's centered on the institution. I'm willing to bet that the results of this A/B test that YouTube allows us to do in the studio will reveal that people clicked on the people, which isn't too surprising. People connect with faces. But herein lies the potentiality for that problem. The way that we investigate harms. Because we often need to attach problems to people and grand displays of harm in order to address them, which allows the mundane problems of everyday life to reign with impunity. We need a George Floyd in order to take police brutality seriously rather than critically assessing the systems that lead to a George Floyd so that we can address them before a life be lost. We need a white person to say in order to address racism and anti-blackness, rather than tuning our ears to the dog whistles we hear on an everyday basis. This very mechanism is the same muscle that allows liberal institutions, the very ones that claim to operate out of a desire to help marginalized people. The lack of resolution in the spectacles that we use to view our society allow us to only see the grand miscarriages of justice and miss the mundane miscarriages of justice that occur every day, that occur in places we deem to be safe, like leftist communities, in places dedicated to fixing problems rather than making them themselves.